He thought today would humiliate her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he was stepping into the one courtroom where he would lose everything. The air inside courtroom 3B felt heavier than usual that morning, thick with quiet anticipation as polished wooden benches filled with spectators, attorneys, and a few curious reporters who had caught word of an unusual case. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor, where every footstep echoed with a sharp, deliberate rhythm. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Holloway, a man whose reputation for control and precision had made him one of the most feared figures in the county's legal system. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his robe immaculate, and his expression carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never once been publicly challenged. He adjusted his glasses slowly, scanning the courtroom with a gaze that seemed to weigh and measure every person present, already deciding who mattered and who did not. Then his eyes landed on her. Emma Carter stood quietly near the defense table, her posture straight but unassuming, dressed in a simple navy cardigan and modest slacks that made her blend almost effortlessly into the background. At 36, there was nothing about her appearance that commanded attention, nothing that suggested she belonged in a room where reputations were made or destroyed in a matter of minutes. To most people watching, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place, someone unprepared for the sharp edges of the legal world. And that was exactly what Judge Holloway believed. He leaned forward slightly, tapping his pen against the bench with a measured rhythm that carried across the silent room, a subtle signal that the performance was about to begin. This case, though minor on paper, had drawn his personal interest for a reason no one else seemed to fully understand. Weeks earlier, Emma had made the quiet mistake of questioning one of his rulings at a public hearing, not loudly, not emotionally, but with a calm precision that had lingered in his mind longer than he cared to admit. It wasn't defiance that bothered him. It was the unsettling clarity of her words, the way she had spoken as if she understood the law not as an outsider, but as someone who could see through it. And today he intended to remind her exactly where she stood. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom as he called the session to order, his voice smooth and controlled, carrying an edge that only those familiar with him could recognize as something far sharper beneath the surface. "Ms. Carter," he said, drawing out her name just enough to command attention, "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself today." A few quiet chuckles echoed from the gallery, quickly stifled but not unnoticed. Emma lifted her gaze, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, offering a simple nod in response. Holloway's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, the kind reserved for moments when he believed the outcome was already decided. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if everyone could sense that this was no ordinary hearing, that something was unfolding just beneath the surface. The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his hands with deliberate ease, already preparing his next words, already certain of the path this would take. What he didn't see, what no one in that room noticed, was the subtle stillness in Emma's posture, the quiet focus behind her calm expression, as if she wasn't standing in uncertainty at all, but waiting. The faint sound of the gavel echoed once, sharp and controlled, as Judge Holloway leaned forward, his expression now carrying a subtle edge of amusement that had not been there before. He adjusted a stack of papers in front of him with deliberate precision, as if preparing for a routine case, though the slight narrowing of his eyes suggested something far more intentional. "Let us proceed," he said calmly, his voice filling the room with practiced authority. "Miss Carter, since you have elected to represent yourself, I trust you understand the complexity of these proceedings." His tone was polite on the surface, but the implication beneath it was unmistakable. A few heads in the gallery tilted slightly, curiosity growing as the tension began to take shape. Emma remained still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze steady but neutral. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the silent courtroom. Holloway gave a slow nod, though his lips tightened almost imperceptibly, as if disappointed by the lack of hesitation in her response. He flipped open the case file and began outlining the charges, his words precise, each sentence delivered with a measured cadence designed to emphasize complexity. Legal terminology filled the air, layered and dense, the kind meant to overwhelm anyone without formal training. As he spoke, he occasionally glanced up, watching Emma closely, as though expecting confusion to surface at any moment. It never did. Instead, she listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture composed. That stillness began to shift something in the room. A low murmur passed through the back rows before quickly fading, replaced by a growing, almost uncomfortable quiet. Holloway noticed it too, and his pen tapped once more against the bench, this time slightly sharper. He paused mid-sentence, then leaned forward again. "Perhaps," he said, his voice now carrying a faint trace of condescension, "it would be helpful if I simplified certain aspects for you." A few restrained smiles appeared among the observers, subtle but present. Emma's eyes lifted just slightly, meeting his for the briefest moment. "That will not be necessary, Your Honor," she said calmly. The words landed with unexpected weight. For a fraction of a second, Holloway's expression froze, barely noticeable unless one was watching closely. Then he leaned back, exhaling through his nose as if amused, though the tightness in his jaw suggested otherwise. "Very well," he replied, his tone cooling. He continued, but now there was a shift in his delivery, faster, sharper, layering arguments with increasing complexity, as though building a structure designed to trap rather than clarify. Each point seemed crafted to corner her, to push her into a mistake that could be exposed in front of everyone. The courtroom followed every word, the silence deepening with each passing moment. Emma did not interrupt. She did not react. She simply listened. Her eyes moved occasionally, not toward the judge, but toward the documents, toward the phrasing, toward the details most people would have missed entirely. It was not the look of someone trying to keep up. It was the look of someone studying something already familiar. Minutes passed, though it felt longer, the tension stretching thin across the room. Finally, Holloway closed the file with a firm motion and folded his hands together. "Given the circumstances," he said, his voice steady once more, "I assume you have little to add in your defense." A quiet expectation settled over the courtroom, the kind that precedes an inevitable outcome. Emma did not respond immediately. She remained still for a brief moment longer, as if allowing the silence itself to settle into place. And then, slowly, she reached for a single sheet of paper. The faint rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have as Emma Carter lifted the single sheet from the table, the movement small yet deliberate enough to draw every eye in the courtroom back to her. She did not rush. She did not look up immediately. Instead, her gaze settled on the document, as if confirming something she had already known long before she stepped into that room. Judge Holloway watched her closely now, the earlier trace of amusement fading into something more measured, more cautious, though he masked it behind a composed expression. "If you have something relevant to present," he said, his tone sharpened just slightly, "you may proceed." There was a subtle impatience in his voice, the kind that came from a man accustomed to controlling both the pace and the outcome. Emma finally looked up, her eyes steady, her voice calm. "Thank you, Your Honor." The words were simple, but the way she said them carried a quiet confidence that did not belong to someone out of their depth. A faint shift moved through the room, almost imperceptible, like a current changing direction beneath still water. She placed the paper gently on the table in front of her, but instead of immediately reading from it, she spoke. "Before I respond to the court's summary," she began, "I would like to clarify one procedural detail." The phrase itself was enough to cause a few heads to turn. It was not what anyone had expected. Holloway's pen stilled in his hand. "Clarify," he repeated, leaning back slightly, his voice controlled, though his eyes narrowed just a fraction. Emma nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, the basis on which this proceeding was initiated." A quiet murmur rippled through the back rows before quickly fading into silence. The judge's fingers tapped once against the bench, slower this time. "The basis has already been established," he replied, his tone firm, attempting to reassert control. "If you have a defense, I suggest you present it." Emma did not react to the dismissal. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, as if considering his words, then continued in the same calm tone. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the foundation of the case determines whether a defense is even required." The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. For the first time since the hearing began, Holloway did not immediately respond. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Emma took a small step forward, not dramatic, not confrontational, just enough to shift her presence from passive to intentional. According to Section 12, subsection B of the State Procedural Code, she said, her voice steady, a notice of violation must be issued with verified documentation prior to formal proceedings. She paused briefly, allowing the words to settle. That documentation is not present in the case file. The room went still. Not the polite quiet from before, but a sharper, more focused silence. Holloway's gaze dropped to the file in front of him, flipping through the pages with controlled precision, though the speed of the movement betrayed something else beneath the surface. A faint crease formed between his brows. Emma did not speak again. She did not need to. She simply watched, her expression unchanged, as if she had already anticipated this exact moment. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, the earlier confidence shifting into curiosity, then something closer to realization. The judge closed the file more firmly than before, lifting his eyes back to her. Even if that were the case, he began, his voice steady but lower now, it would not invalidate the entirety of the proceeding. Emma's response came without hesitation. It would, Your Honor. Her tone did not rise. It did not challenge. It simply stated, because without proper initiation, the court does not have standing to enforce the claim. The words landed clean, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. And for the first time that morning, Judge Holloway did not interrupt. He did not dismiss. He simply looked at her, as the weight of the room shifted in a way he could no longer fully control. The silence did not break immediately. It deepened, stretching across the courtroom like a tension that no one dared to disturb, as if every person present understood, at least instinctively, that something irreversible had just begun. Judge Holloway remained still for a moment longer than usual, his fingers resting on the closed file, his posture rigid but controlled, the kind of stillness that masked calculation rather than calm. Then, slowly, he leaned forward again, adjusting his glasses with a precision that felt more deliberate than before. Ms. Carter, he said, his voice measured, carefully neutral. You are interpreting procedural nuance as if it were absolute. The words were chosen carefully, but the underlying intent was clear, to reframe, to diminish, to regain ground. Emma did not move. Procedure defines validity, Your Honor, she replied quietly. No emphasis, no force, just clarity. A faint shift passed through the gallery, the kind that happens when confidence begins to change direction. Holloway's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, before he opened the file again, flipping through pages with more intent this time, his eyes scanning quickly, searching. The court has discretion, he continued, his tone firmer now, especially in cases where technical deficiencies do not affect the substance of the matter. It was a strong statement, one that might have ended the discussion under normal circumstances. But nothing about this moment was normal anymore. Emma's gaze lowered briefly to the document in front of her, then lifted again, steady as ever. Discretion applies within jurisdiction, she said, not outside of it. The words landed with quiet precision, and this time, there was no murmur, no movement, just a stillness that felt sharper than before. Holloway did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, as if trying to place something that did not fit the picture he had already decided on. The room waited. Emma took a small breath, not out of hesitation, but as if preparing to complete something already in motion. If the initiating notice lacks verification, she continued, then the court's authority to proceed is not merely weakened. It is absent. She paused, just long enough for the weight of the statement to settle. That is not interpretation. That is precedent. Somewhere in the back of the room, a chair creaked softly, the sound unusually loud in the silence. Holloway's fingers tapped once against the bench again, but this time the rhythm was uneven, just enough to betray a shift beneath the surface. He turned another page, then another, the movement controlled but faster now, as if confirming something he had not expected to need to confirm. Emma remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression unchanged, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the center of the room in a way that no one had anticipated. You are making a very specific claim, Holloway said finally, his voice lower now, more deliberate, each word measured with care. Emma nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Another pause followed, longer this time. The judge's gaze moved from the file back to her, then briefly to the courtroom, where every face seemed fixed on the exchange, waiting. The authority that had filled the room earlier had not disappeared, but it had shifted, fractured in a way that could not be easily repaired. Holloway closed the file again, slower now, his movements no longer carrying the same certainty as before. For the first time that morning, he did not immediately speak. And in that silence, the balance of the courtroom tilted in a direction no one had expected. The air in the courtroom felt different now, no longer charged with quiet anticipation, but tightened by a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted beyond recovery. Judge Holloway sat motionless for a brief second longer, his eyes fixed on Emma Carter, not with dismissal anymore, but with a careful scrutiny that had replaced his earlier certainty. It was the look of a man recalculating. Slowly, he straightened in his chair, his posture returning to its usual authority, though the subtle delay had already been noticed by more than a few in the room. Even if your interpretation holds weight, he said, his voice controlled but firmer than before, this court is not bound to collapse proceedings over a single procedural concern. The statement sounded strong, but there was a faint strain beneath it now, like a structure holding under pressure rather than standing effortlessly. Emma did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the document again, lifting it slightly, her fingers steady, her movements unhurried. The silence stretched, not empty, but full, as if every second carried meaning. Then she spoke. It is not a single concern, Your Honor. Her tone remained calm, but something in it had changed, not louder, not sharper, but deeper, more certain. Holloway's gaze narrowed. Explain. The word was short, direct, but no longer dismissive. Emma inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the shift. The absence of verification is the first issue, she said, her voice clear and even. The second is the absence of proper filing within the statutory time frame. A faint ripple moved through the courtroom, quickly silenced, but unmistakable. Holloway's fingers pressed lightly against the bench, no longer tapping. That claim has not been raised previously, he replied, though the edge in his voice had softened into something more cautious. Emma met his gaze without hesitation. It was not necessary to raise it earlier, she said. It is evident within the record. The words landed with quiet force. Holloway opened the file again, flipping more quickly now, his eyes scanning line after line, searching for confirmation or contradiction. The room watched him this time, not her. That alone marked the shift. Emma continued, her voice steady, measured, as if laying out something inevitable rather than arguing. The notice was filed 11 days after the statutory limit, she said. The maximum allowable period is 10. She paused just long enough. That exceeds the court's authority to proceed. A silence followed that felt heavier than anything before it. Even the subtle movements in the gallery had stopped entirely. Holloway's hand paused mid-page. His eyes remained fixed on the document, but the stillness carried a different weight now, one that could not be dismissed with tone or authority. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he closed the file slowly, more carefully than before, as if aware that every movement was now being observed, interpreted, measured. He looked up again, his expression composed, but the confidence that had filled the room at the beginning had thinned into something more restrained. You are presenting multiple procedural objections simultaneously, he said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. Emma nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Another pause. The kind that no longer belonged to him alone. The courtroom did not feel like his stage anymore. It felt like a place where something was being revealed, piece by piece, beyond his control. Emma remained still, her presence steady, her voice no longer that of someone defending, but of someone concluding. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer about whether she could respond. It was about how much more she had yet to say. The weight of the courtroom had shifted completely now, no longer anchored to the elevated bench where Judge Holloway sat, but suspended in the space between his silence and Emma Carter's quiet certainty. For several seconds, no one moved. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder in the absence of his immediate response. Holloway finally drew a slow breath, his fingers pressing together as he leaned forward, attempting to gather the authority that had once come so effortlessly. Procedural arguments, he said carefully, do not automatically negate the substance of a case. His voice was controlled, but there was a subtle hesitation between the words, as if each one required more thought than before. Emma did not interrupt. She waited, allowing him to finish, allowing the statement to settle into the room. Then she spoke. They do when the procedure defines whether the case can exist at all. Her tone did not change, but the clarity of it cut through the space more sharply than anything louder ever could. A faint shift passed through the gallery again, though this time it was not curiosity. It was recognition. Holloway's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for uncertainty, for doubt, for anything that might restore the imbalance he had relied on. He found none. Instead, he reached for the file once more, flipping through it again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if hoping that repetition might produce a different outcome. It did not. Emma's voice continued, steady, unhurried, each word placed with precision. Without verified initiation, the notice fails, she said. Without timely filing, the claim expires. She paused briefly. Without both, the court has no standing. The final words seemed to settle into the room like a closing statement, though she had not raised her voice, had not changed her pace, had not done anything except speak the law as if it were already decided. Holloway's hand stilled on the page. The faint crease between his brows deepened, no longer subtle, no longer easily hidden. Around the courtroom, the stillness had become absolute. No shifting, no whispering, no movement. Every person present was now watching the same thing, not her, but him. That, more than anything, marked the turning point. He closed the file again, but this time the motion lacked the finality it once carried. It felt cautious, almost reluctant. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers once more, but the dynamic had changed in a way that could not be reversed. You are asserting, he said, his voice quieter now, that this court lacks jurisdiction entirely. The question hung in the air, though it did not sound like a challenge anymore. Emma nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. No hesitation. No emphasis. Just certainty. Another silence followed, longer than any before it, stretching across the courtroom as if time itself had slowed to accommodate what was happening. Holloway did not speak immediately. He did not interrupt. He did not redirect. For the first time since the hearing began, he was no longer controlling the pace of the room. Emma remained still, her presence steady, her expression calm, as though she had simply arrived at the conclusion she had known all along. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching that the question was no longer whether she understood the law. It was whether the man presiding over the court could afford to ignore it. The silence that followed did not feel temporary anymore. It felt settled, as if the courtroom itself had accepted a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud. Judge Holloway remained still, his gaze fixed on Emma Carter, but the authority that once filled his posture had shifted into something more restrained, more careful. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached for the edge of the bench, his fingers tightening slightly, as if grounding himself before speaking again. Jurisdiction, he repeated, his voice quieter now, measured with a precision that carried less certainty than before, is not dismissed lightly. The statement was deliberate, an attempt to reclaim control through principle rather than tone. Emma did not respond immediately. She allowed the words to rest in the air, as if acknowledging them before continuing. Then she spoke, her voice steady, unwavering. Neither is it assumed, Your Honor. The response was calm, but it landed with unmistakable weight. A faint shift moved through the gallery, though no one dared to break the silence. Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her again, but this time the look was different. It was no longer dismissive, no longer superior. It was searching, careful. He leaned forward once more, opening the file again, though the movement lacked the earlier confidence it once carried. Page by page, he scanned, slower now, more deliberate, as if each line required verification he had never questioned before. The room watched him, every subtle movement amplified by the stillness surrounding it. Emma remained where she stood, her hands resting lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that anchored the entire room. She did not Press. She did not interrupt. She simply waited. And that waiting carried more pressure than any argument could have. You are asking this court, Holloway said finally, without looking up, to invalidate its own proceeding. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the silence. Emma answered without hesitation. I am asking the court to recognize the limits of its authority. There was no challenge in her tone. No defiance. Only clarity. Holloway closed the file again, slower this time, his hand lingering on its surface for a brief second before he lifted his gaze. Around him, the courtroom remained completely still, every person present now fully aware that they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary hearing. And if the court disagrees, he asked, his voice low, measured, though the question itself no longer carried the same weight it once would have. Emma met his gaze, her expression calm, her eyes steady. Then the record will reflect it. The words were simple, but the implication behind them settled heavily into the room. For the first time, Holloway did not immediately respond. His posture remained upright, his expression composed, but the pause stretched longer than any before it, long enough for the shift in power to become undeniable. The courtroom no longer felt like a stage he controlled. It felt like a space where every decision would now be seen, measured, remembered. A faint sound came from the back of the room, quickly silenced, but enough to remind everyone that they were not alone in witnessing this moment. Holloway's gaze moved briefly across the courtroom, taking in the still faces, the quiet attention, the weight of observation that now surrounded him. Then he looked back at Emma Carter. And in that moment, it was no longer a matter of authority versus defiance. It was something far more fragile. It was credibility. The courtroom did not move, but something inside it had already changed beyond reversal, like a structure that still stood upright, but had lost its foundation beneath the surface. Judge Holloway sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Emma Carter, but the confidence that once defined his presence had thinned into something more fragile, more deliberate. For a long moment, he said nothing. The weight of that silence stretched across the room, pressing against every person watching, until even the smallest sound felt intrusive. Then, slowly, he reached for the gavel, his hand pausing just above it before resting again on the bench instead. It was a small hesitation, barely noticeable, but in a room this quiet, it echoed louder than any words. The court will review the procedural concerns raised, he said finally, his voice measured, controlled, though no longer carrying the same unquestioned authority it once had. Emma did not move. She did not react. She simply stood there, her posture steady, her presence calm, as if she had expected this exact moment all along. Holloway opened the file again, but this time the movement lacked any trace of performance. He was not presenting anymore. He was checking, confirming, verifying. Page after page, his eyes moved with increasing focus, no longer scanning for support, but searching for error. The courtroom watched him in complete silence, the shift now undeniable. The man who had begun the hearing with control was now working to maintain it. Seconds passed, then more. The stillness grew heavier, not with tension anymore, but with realization. Holloway stopped on a page, his eyes lingering there longer than before. A faint tightening crossed his expression, subtle but unmistakable. He flipped back, then forward again, as if confirming what he was seeing could not be dismissed. Across the room, no one moved. No one spoke. Emma remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly against the table, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. She did not need to press the point. The truth was unfolding on its own. Holloway closed the file slowly, more carefully than he had at any point that morning. His hand remained on top of it for a brief second before he lifted his gaze once more. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. The court acknowledges, he said, each word measured, deliberate, that there are significant procedural deficiencies present in this case. The words settled into the room like a final shift, one that no one could ignore. A faint stir moved through the gallery, quickly silenced, but enough to mark the moment. Emma did not respond immediately. She simply inclined her head slightly, not in victory, not in relief, but in recognition. Holloway continued, though the pace of his speech had changed, slower now, more precise. Given these findings, the court cannot proceed under the current filing. The statement was, clear, final. But it did not feel like an announcement of authority. It felt like an acceptance of limitation. The room remained silent, though the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a demonstration of control had become something else entirely. Holloway leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture still composed, but the weight of the moment lingered around him in a way that could not be undone. Across from him, Emma Carter stood exactly as she had before, calm, steady, unchanged. And in that stillness, it became clear to everyone present that nothing she had done had been dramatic, nothing had been forced. She had simply spoken, and the room had listened. And that was enough. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, settling into the quiet space of the courtroom with a weight that no one could ignore. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the subtle shifting of chairs and papers had disappeared, replaced by a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the room itself understood the significance of what had just happened. Judge Holloway remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the bench, his posture composed but no longer commanding. The authority that had once filled his presence had not vanished, but it had changed, tempered by something quieter, something far more human. He reached for the gavel again, this time without hesitation, and brought it down once with a firm, controlled motion. "This matter is dismissed," he said, his voice steady, though stripped of the earlier sharpness that had defined it. The sound echoed across the room, marking the end of the proceedings, but not the end of what had unfolded. Emma Carter did not react immediately. She did not smile, did not show relief, did not look around for acknowledgement. Instead, she simply gathered the single sheet of paper from the table, her movements calm and unhurried, as if the outcome had never been in question. Around her, the courtroom began to shift, slowly at first, as people adjusted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried a mixture of surprise, respect, and something deeper that had not been there before. A quiet murmur started to form, then faded again, as if no one wanted to break the moment too quickly. Emma turned slightly, preparing to leave, her presence once again blending into the quiet. Simplicity that had defined her from the beginning. But as she took her first step away from the table, there was a brief pause. Not from her, but from the bench. Judge Holloway's voice followed, quieter now, but clear enough to reach her. "Ms. Carter." She stopped, turning back just enough to acknowledge him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. For a brief moment, he said nothing. The pause stretched, not with tension, but with something closer to reflection. "You presented your argument with clarity," he said finally, the words measured, chosen with care. It was not an apology. It was not an admission. But it was something that had not existed at the beginning of the hearing. Emma inclined her head slightly, accepting the words without reaction, without triumph. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied softly. And that was all. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps quiet against the marble floor, each one echoing just enough to remind those still seated that something important had just taken place. No dramatic gestures, no raised voices, just truth, spoken clearly and allowed to stand. As the courtroom slowly returned to motion, the balance of the room remained altered, not in a way that could be easily explained, but in a way that would not be forgotten. Judge Holloway remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze following the path she had taken, his expression unreadable, but no longer dismissive. The file in front of him stayed closed, untouched, as if reopening it would change nothing. And in the quiet that followed, one thing had become undeniable. Power could command attention, but only understanding could command respect. And that day, in a courtroom built on authority, it was not authority that defined the outcome.